So if you're like a lot of people in the Western world, you probably believe a story that goes something like this. There was this great library in Alexandria, and it was destroyed by a Christian mob. Well, I've got an article written by a guy named Tim O'Neill that you should probably read. But I'd like to look at some of the key points and sum it up here, because it presents a very different history from what people commonly believe. The story goes something like this. The great library was a place where the wise, rational Greeks and Romans store up all the wisdom of the pre-Christian ancient world in a single library. They treasure science and reason, and we were on the brink of intellectual and technological revolution. But then a screaming mob of irrational Christian zealots puts this treasure of science and learning to the torch. It's the greatest book burning of all time, ushering in the Dark Ages, setting us back by 1,000 years. Now, Tim O'Neill argues that this story of Christians destroying science is central to a moral fable called the Draper-White thesis. It is the conflict thesis. It's a historiographical approach in the history of science which maintains that there is an intrinsic intellectual conflict between religion and science, and that the relationship between religion and science inevitably leads to hostility. Examples to support this thesis have commonly been drawn from the relations between science and religion in Western Europe. The thesis retains support among some scientists and in the public, while historians of science reject the thesis. It's a story that you can see retold in Carl Sagan's seminal Cosmos TV series in 1980. And it's given birth to memes like this. This was, in January 2014, a meme posted to Richard Dawkins' Foundation for Reason and Science page on Facebook. It says, "You know you're a history fan when you still get upset thinking about the Library of Alexandria." And you've got people posting things on there saying something like, "Think of how entirely different the human world ever since would have been. Entire fields of human endeavor, following other paths, medicine, agriculture, transportation, architecture, education itself, a virtual alternate universe." And they compile the horror of the spectacle by linking it to another fable, the murder of Hypatia of Alexandria, because of her learning and rationality. She's presented as the last librarian of the great library who was murdered by these Christians. And that's despite the fact both the great library and its daughter library in the Serapeum had ceased to exist for about 100 years before she was even born. So, who's responsible for these myths? It's mostly a guy, and his name is Carl Sagan. He was an American astronomer, cosmologist, astrophysicist, astrobiologist, author, and science popularizer. His best-known scientific contribution is research on extraterrestrial life. And he also wrote the science fiction novel Contact, the basis for a 1997 film of the same name. So like his other stories, this is another science fiction fantasy. So Sagan is the one who tells us the moral fable of the great library of Alexandria and its fall to Christian irrationality and superstition. Carl Sagan didn't invent this story, though. It actually lies in the 18th century, and the main perpetrator was a guy named Edward Gibbon, who was writing somewhere between 1776 and 1778. Gibbon had several ideological axes to grind, and one of them was anti-Christian. His book shows a strong reaction to the Catholicism he had briefly flirted with as a student. So apparently, God didn't grant him all his wishes when he was in college, so he reacted spitefully and became an atheist. He wrote a book, Decline and Fall, which was a bestseller, and for all its many errors and faults, it was the most read book on the subject of the fall of Rome for several centuries. Unfortunately, it's also highly influential on popular conceptions of that subject. Carl Sagan was drawing on Gibbon's tradition to the Great Library, which means the ideas on the subject that we have are third or fourth hand. So what was the Great Library? Most modern accounts say the Great Library was founded at the beginning of the 3rd century, when Demetrios of Phaleron, a former student of Theophrastos, who was in turn a student and successor of Aristotle, who went into exile in the fledgling city of Alexandria and proposed a plan for the library to Ptolemy I. So this is a neat little story that makes a direct link between Aristotle and the founding of the library. The only problem is, it's not true. We don't know exactly who founded the library, and we aren't clear on when. So the author here goes on to explain, what should also be made clear is it was not actually a library that was established at all. The Great Library that we refer to was a collection of books associated with a religious shrine, pronounced the mausoleum or the motion, the modern word for museum, which translates to Temple of the Muses. And this institution was, as the name implies, dedicated to the 9 Muses. What we call the Great Library was a collection of books gathered to service the scholars who were housed and worked in the motion, and it was stored partially in the complex itself and later on other sites, including at least 3 daughter libraries. The popular image of the Great Library as an echoing hall lined with shelves of scrolls with desks and tables for scholars is almost certainly inaccurate. That kind of library, which is still the model for many traditionally styled libraries today, was developed much later by the Romans, and the motion would instead have had a colonnade with a lineup of rooms behind. The rooms would serve for shelving the holdings, and the colonnade provide space for the readers. The motion at Alexandria was far from the only shrine to the Muses in the ancient world, nor was it the only one with an associated center of study. Pythagoras had recommended the establishment of a shrine to the Muses for the promotion of learning on his first arrival on Croton, for example, and the Seleucid kings built one at Antioch in the late 2nd century BC, with an attendant center for study and a library. Now, one of the claims is it was the largest library in the ancient world, and it contained over 700,000 books. Well, we get a lot of sources that say a lot of different things. We have Seneca the Younger in AD 50 saying there were 40,000 scrolls, not books. This isn't like a modern library with hardcover bound books on the shelf. This stuff was written down on scrolls. You have Orosius in 400 AD saying that there was 400,000 scrolls. You have Ammianus Marcellinus in 390 AD claiming 700,000 scrolls, and you have Epiphanes in AD 380 claiming there was 54,800 scrolls. So, the numbers used by Epiphanes are the only ones that seem suspiciously precise. But a lot of discussion by critical scholars, they say the best thing is that none of these figures are reliable. One of the ways they estimate the size of ancient libraries is by examining the floor plans of their ruins. However, archaeologists don't have any guesses to exactly where the one in Alexandria was. So Columbia University's Roger S. Bagnall used a method he begins with how many authors we know about that were writing at that time. So he says there's about 450 authors for whom at least we have some lines of writing, and whose work existed in the 4th century BC, and another 175 from the 3rd century. He points out most of these writers probably only wrote works that filled a couple of scrolls at most. So by adopting an almost certainly far too high a figure of 50 scrolls per writer, Bagnall arrives at a mere 31,250 scrolls to contain all the works of all the writers we know about to the end of the 3rd century. Bagnall makes other calculations, taking into account guesses at what number of completely lost authors there may have been, and still does not manage to get close to the figure in some of our sources, 700,000 books. His analysis makes it fairly clear that these numbers are presented so uncritically by popular authors for rhetorical effect that it's nothing more than a fantasy. A comparable library, the library in the Forum of Trajan in Rome, occupied a large space, 27 by 20 meters, and Lionel Casson estimates it could have held in the neighborhood of 20,000 scrolls. A similar survey of the remains of the Great Library of Pergamon comes to an estimate of 30,000 scrolls. That's a far cry from the 500,000 to 700,000 books. One of the more bizarre myths that is floating around the Great Library is that its destruction wiped out an advanced scientific knowledge, all of the scientific knowledge of the ancient world in this one terrible cataclysm. But you don't have to think about that for very long to realize that's a silly idea. The idea that there was just one library in the whole of the ancient world is ridiculous and untrue. And as the mentions of other rival libraries above have already made it clear, there were hundreds of libraries, great and small, across the ancient world. The Ptolemies were not the only successors to Alexander who built a Museion with a library. Their Seleucid rivals in Syria built one in Antioch. Roman aristocrats and rulers also included the establishment of substantial libraries as a part of their civic service. And the largest Roman libraries was that of Trajan. As mentioned above, this building probably contained about 20,000 scrolls and had 2 main chambers. So it wasn't a unique building. It was arguably considered the largest, but there were libraries everywhere, and it didn't have a bunch of books. It had some scrolls. It didn't have a ton of advanced scientific knowledge, but what was in it? There's this common theme. It was a center for the study of science, and its loss set back technology by 1,000 years. Is that really true? Well, let's read on. The author points out that the scholars of the Great Library did not do anything like what we would call science. This whole idea that the Museion was established as an institution of some great center of science doesn't have any evidence. Looking back on historical sources, the Great Library was actually celebrated for specialization in a particular topic that is about as far from modern science as possible, and that's the study of poetry. And this makes sense, given that the Museion was dedicated to the Muses. It's the temple of the Muses. The works of Homer, in particular, were a primary focus of study across the Greek world. It was the scholars of the Museion who worked on gathering and comparing copies of the Iliad and Odyssey from across the Greek-speaking world. So, those books have survived to this day. You can go pick them up at Barnes & Noble's. So much for that terrible loss. The article goes on, the importance of literary studies at the Museion can be seen by analyzing the specializations of the men we know who were directors of the institution, and therefore the so-called librarians of the Great Library. And here's a useful table. First librarian, Demetrios, whose primary intellectual field was philosophy. Zenodotos, who studied Homeric textual criticism. Callimachus, his area of study was bibliography and poetry. Apollonius of Rhodes, who served about 270 to 245, studied epic poetry. Eratosthenes, 245 to 204, was a student of geography. Aristophanes of Byzantium, 204 to 189, studied textual criticism. Apollonius, from 189 to 175, was a student of textual criticism and grammar. And Aristarchus, from 175 to 145, was a student of grammar. So none of these people were known for doing anything we would consider science. The idea that the Motion was a major center of scientific speculation is just an exaggeration and pure fantasy. Historians also sometimes refer to Greek natural philosophy as science. Of course, it's important to remember that in Greek natural philosophy, they had 4 elements: earth, air, water, and fire. This was one of the reasons there was no direct link between their proto-scientific science and technology. The idea that if the Great Library had not been burned down by wicked Christians and we should all be living in space cities is ridiculous, and not in the least because the Great Library wasn't burned down by Christians. In the Great Library's case, it was a slow decline suffering a series of disasters. So the author points out anyone who works in library services will tell you that the main enemy of a library's continuation is lack of funding. The papyrus scrolls decay, fall apart from use, suffer damage from mice and vermin, and this is in a period where there's no artificial light, so everyone's using oil lamps and there's a constant danger of fire. It would take a large, expensive staff of either employees or slaves that would have to constantly do the unending task of repairing, replacing, and recopying scrolls. But war has always been one of the main destroyers of libraries down the ages, and the Great Library's slow decline was marked by several sacks, which eventually led to the end of the Motion. The first and probably the most significant came in 47 BC, when Julius Caesar took the side of Cleopatra in her claim on the Ptolemy throne and besieged her younger brother, the boy king Ptolemy XIII, in Alexandria. Caesar's own account mentions that he burned a fleet in the docks of the city, but makes no mention of this fire destroying anything else. He does go out of his way to say Alexandria is well nigh fireproof because its buildings contain no wooden joinery and are held together by an arched construction and are roofed with rough cast or tiling. It is Plutarch who first depicts this fire as destroying the Great Library in almost a casual offhand mention that perhaps assumes this was common knowledge. He says, "In this war, to begin with, Caesar encountered the peril of being shut off from the water, since the canals were dammed up by the enemy. In the second place, when the enemy tried to cut off his fleet, he was forced to repel the danger by using fire, and this spread from the dockyards and destroyed the Great Library." So Aulus Gellius's mention of the Great Library says that the collection numbered nearly 700,000 volumes, and then adds, "But these were all burned down during the sack of the city in our first war with Alexandria," referring to Caesar's siege. So there's some debate on how literally we can take these reports that the whole Great Library was destroyed, especially given that the docks of Alexandria were some distance from the Motion's likely location. The fact that so many writers agree that Caesar's fire destroyed the Great Library can't be ignored, and at the very least the fire seems to have destroyed a substantial portion of the collection of scrolls, probably stored in warehouses on the docks. But this was not the end of the Motion, and not the end of its whole collection. Writers from around the end of the reign of Caesar's dynasty onwards tend to refer to the Great Library in the past tense and any surviving collection was probably greatly reduced after 47 BC. But it was the calamitous 3rd century AD that saw a succession of military disasters in Alexandria and seems to have seen the final end of the Motion. The real end probably came in 272 AD when Aurelian stormed the Bruchon, with Ammianus noting, Alexandria's walls were destroyed, and she lost the greater part of the district called the Bruchon. And if that sack didn't mean the death blow for the institution, Diocletian probably finished the job when he too sacked the city in 295 AD. Now, if you don't know anything about Diocletian, he's as far from a Christian as you can possibly get. He's responsible in Rome for what was called the Great Persecution, and it was the last and most severe persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. A series of religious edicts rescinding Christians' legal rights and demanding that they comply with traditional religious practices. Later edicts targeted the clergy and demanded universal sacrifice, ordering all inhabitants to sacrifice to the traditional gods. So far be it from the Christians burning it down, it was the anti-Christians that most likely finished off the Great Library. So the author goes on to ask this question. If the Great Library ceased to exist in the century before Christianity came to power in the empire, how did Christians get stuck with the charge of destroying it? The answer lies not in the evidence about the Great Library, but in the history of one of its daughter libraries in the annex of the Serapeum. So there were at least 2 daughter libraries in the city, one in the Caesarion, or Temple of Caesar, another in the Serapean, the Temple of Serapis. And Serapis was this Greek-Egyptian hybrid deity that combined Zeus and Osiris. So in 391 AD, the Serapeum was indeed torn down by Roman soldiers and a Christian mob, and it is here finally that we find the seed of the myth. There is no fire involved, and it is the daughter library that was supposedly destroyed, not the Great Library itself, which had ceased to exist by this point, but the myth is cobbled together from this episode and some garbled reflections of the story of Caesar's fire. The problem, however, is there is no evidence that the Temple of Serapis still contained a library by 391 AD. These retellings focus on the supposed destruction of its library, so they tend to assume that the mob was there simply because they hated learning. But several of the accounts of the end of the temple note that it came as the climax of a series of attacks by pagans on Christians in reaction to the desecration of pagan idols. A historian named Sozomen was writing in the following century gave the following details of the account. They killed many of the Christians, wounded others, and seized the Serapeum, a temple, which was conspicuous for beauty and vastness, and which was seated on an eminence. This they converted into a temporary citadel, and hither they conveyed many of the Christians, put them to the torture, and compelled them to offer sacrifice. Those who refused compliance were crucified, had both legs broken, or were put to death in some cruel manner. When the sedition had prevailed for some time, the rulers came and urged the people to remember the laws, to lay down their arms, and to give up the Serapeum. Socrates Scholasticus, writing a little closer to the events, confirms that many of the Christians were killed in the unrest. A standoff followed with Roman troops surrounding the temple, while negotiations went on with pagan militants inside. This situation must have continued for many weeks, as a petition went to the emperor in Constantinople about the siege, and Theodosius ruled that the pagans should be pardoned for their murders and allowed to leave, but that the temple should be demolished. Angry at this compromise, as the soldiers began to demolish the temple, the Christian mob joined in the destruction and made sure the great idol of Serapis was also destroyed. And we actually have no less than 5 accounts of this discussion. Rufinus, Tyrannius, Socrates, Scholasticus, Sozomen, Theodoret, and Eunapius of Antioch, which is rare in ancient history and actually makes this one of the best documented events in the period. So, the author concludes here, the story of the destruction of the Great Library is a positivist fairy tale, cobbled together from disparate elements and bearing almost no relationship to accurate history. The library was not a secular establishment, it was not as large as is claimed, it was not a particular center of science, and it was not a wellspring of wondrous technology. Most importantly, it was not destroyed by a crazed Christian mob intent on the destruction of rationally based knowledge. So, more likely than anything, it was a good-sized temple full of poetry. And this is you might ask yourself, like, why do these myths pervade? Why is this pushed? And it all comes back to sophistry. And this is a particular logical fallacy. You can see it's called Kefka trapping, which is a sophistical and unfalsifiable form of argument that attempts to overcome an opponent by inducing a sense of guilt and using that opponent's denial of guilt as further evidence of guilt. You also see this being used a lot in modern times when you talk about white privilege, and you say, well, I don't have white privilege, and that's exactly what someone with white privilege would say. Right? It's used in racism, and you'll say, well, I'm not a racist, and they go, well, your racism is unconscious then, and that's even worse. There's no escape. They don't have an actual case to make. They don't have an actual argument, so they rely on just hammering away on your feelings. And it wants to shame you. It wants to make you afraid to say in public that you're a Christian, because it's the Christian's fault that we don't have the cure for cancer and we're not living on the moon. But there's another effect here. It's not just making the Christian feel bad for being who they are. It's also makes it so that if you're the atheist, there's no limit to the justified hatred that you can feel towards the Christian community, because they've deprived the world of the greatest utopia possibly imaginable. And when there's no limit to the justified hatred you can feel, then there is no limit to the evil actions that you can justify.